I used to think the hardest sound in the world to ignore was a thrown rod on a Cummins ISX-15 engine. It is a violent, metallic, tearing sound that tells you exactly how much money you just lost in a fraction of a second. I was wrong. The hardest sound to ignore is the sound of your own blood rushing in your ears when you realize someone you raised just slid a knife into your back, and not just anyone. My nephew. He sat across from me in a glass-walled conference room he insisted we built, wearing a bespoke suit I paid for, telling me I was out. He thought he had the whole thing locked down. He thought he was playing a high-level game of chess while I was still trying to figure out the rules of checkers. What he didn't know, what he was entirely too arrogant to investigate, was that the board we were playing on belonged to me. I mean that literally. But before we get into the details of exactly how you dismantle a corporate coup without ever raising your voice, let me just say, welcome. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor, subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. My name is Elias. I operate out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. If you drive down the I-96 corridor, you've probably seen my trucks. For 35 years, my life has been diesel fuel, way stations, state taxes, and bills of lading. I didn't start in a boardroom. I started under a chassis. I still keep my very first 1988 snap-on torque wrench on my desk. It has a tiny hairline crack in the plastic grip from where I dropped it in the winter of '92. Right when I thought I was going to lose my first rig to the bank. I measure my life by the miles my fleet puts on the asphalt. Julian was my sister's boy. When she passed away, he was 16. Angry at the world, full of a jagged, directionless kind of energy that usually ends up wrapping a car around a telephone pole on a rainy Tuesday night. I took him in. I put a wrench in his hand and told him to stop feeling sorry for himself and start changing oil filters. And for a long time, it worked. He was smart. Too smart, maybe. Cleverness is fast. What I do is slow. I paid for his undergraduate degree, and when he said he wanted to get his MBA, I wrote the check for that too. I thought I was building a successor. I didn't know it yet, but I was financing my own assassin. Our company, Northbound Logistics, was doing about $40 million a year in gross revenue. Not Amazon money, but enough to keep 140 drivers fed and out of the red. Julian came back from business school with a head full of synergy, optimizations, and lean management structures. He stopped wearing work boots and started wearing Italian leather loafers that made absolutely no sound on the concrete floor of the dispatch center. That should have been my first red flag. You don't trust a man in a trucking yard if you can't hear his footsteps. That's exactly what Vance told me. Vance has been my fleet manager for 28 years. He's a man carved out of old oak and stubbornness, who permanently keeps an unlit cigar wedged in the corner of his mouth because his wife made him quit smoking a decade ago. Vance doesn't care about quarterly projections. He cares about tire tread depth and fuel efficiency. We were standing by the maintenance base one morning. The smell of grease and burnt coffee was thick in the air. Beautiful the way certain storms are beautiful to people who know how to weather them. He's a ghost, Elias, Vance said to me, shifting the cigar with his teeth. The kid walks through the yard and the drivers stop talking. They don't like him. He talks down to them, like they're line items on a spreadsheet instead of men with mortgages. I defended Julian. Of course I did. He was family. I told Vance that Julian just needed time to adjust, that his ideas about streamlining our dispatch software were actually pretty solid, which they were. But looking back, I realized Julian wasn't streamlining the software to make the drivers' lives easier. He was doing it to consolidate control. He was building digital walls around the daily operations, and he was making himself the gatekeeper. Here's the thing about logistics. It's an invisible industry until it stops working. People go to the grocery store, they buy their milk, they go home. They never think about the refrigerated trailer that hauled that milk 300 miles through a snowstorm. Julian didn't respect the snowstorm. He only respected the margin on the milk. He started holding meetings without me. He'd take our top operations guys out to lunch at these high-end steakhouses downtown, the kind of places where a ribeye cost $85 and the waiters scrape the crumbs off your table with a little silver blade. I found out about the lunches. because I saw an expense report. $340 at the chop house. When I asked him about it, his jaw did that thing. That slow grinding thing he does when he's trying to manufacture a lie that sounds like an executive summary. He told me it was just team building, just morale boosting for the mid-level guys. I went very, very quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just looked at him, and my thumb automatically started rubbing the rough calluses on the palm of my other hand. Old habit. I let it slide. That was my mistake. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, because I remembered him at 16, crying on my porch in the rain. You let your memories of who a person was blind you to who they are becoming. Over the next 6 months, the atmosphere in the office shifted. It was subtle, a slight hesitation before my floor managers answered my questions. A sudden silence when I walked into the break room. The silence sat like a fifth guest at a 4-person table. Julian convinced me that we needed an outside board of directors to help us scale and secure better lines of credit. He brought in 3 guys, all friends of his from his MBA program. Guys who looked at a semi-truck and saw a depreciating asset, not a lifeline. They looked like they were assembled from a catalog. I agreed to it because I was tired. I was 62. My knees ached when it rained, and the idea of stepping back and letting the younger generation steer the ship sounded like a relief. I kept 51% of the voting shares, of course. I wasn't an idiot. But Julian had a plan for that too. It started on a Tuesday in early November. The sky over Grand Rapids was the color of dirty iron. I came into the office at 5 in the morning, like I always do. The dispatch floor was quiet, just a few night shift guys sipping cold coffee and watching the tracking monitors. I walked into my office and saw a manila folder sitting dead center on my desk. I hadn't left it there. I opened it. Inside were printed emails, not from our company servers, but from a private server Julian had set up. Emails between him, the 3 new board members, and a corporate restructuring firm out of Chicago. I read the first page, then the second. I sat in my chair for a long time. The heater kicked on in the corner, humming a low, steady note. They were planning a vote of no confidence. They had found a loophole in the corporate bylaws I drafted 20 years ago, a clause regarding operational competency and medical leave. Julian had documented every time I went to the doctor for my arthritis. He had framed my joint pain as cognitive decline. He was going to use my own aching bones to strip my majority shares, dilute my ownership, and push me out of the company I built with my bare hands. I closed the folder. I didn't throw it. I didn't curse. Something in my chest did a thing it had never done before. It turned to ice. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the yard office. Vance answered on the first ring. Yeah. Vance's gravelly voice came through the receiver. Vance, I said, come up to my office. Don't let anyone see you. I'm wearing high-vis yellow, Elias. I'm basically a walking highlighter. Just get up here. 2 minutes later, Vance walked in. He looked at me, looked at the folder, and then looked back at me. He closed the door behind him and locked it. You look like you just watched a ghost eat your dog, he said. I slid the folder across the desk. Vance picked it up. He read through the emails. I watched his face. The man rarely shows emotion, but I saw his eyes narrow, and the cigar in his mouth drooped slightly. He's staging a coup, Vance said softly. The kid is staging a coup. He thinks I'm going senile, I said. Are you? No? Good. Vance tossed the folder back on the desk. Because if he pushes this vote through the board, you're out by Friday. He's got the votes, Elias. He brought those 3 suits in specifically for this. They're going to claim you're unfit, hand him the keys, and lock you out of the building. Vance leaned over my desk, his palms flat on the wood. What are we going to do? I looked at the hairline crack in my old snap-on wrench. I thought about the 16-year-old kid on my porch. Then I thought about the man in the Italian loafers plotting to steal my life's work. We, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, are going to let him do it. Vance stared at me like I had suddenly started speaking a dead language. He took the unlit cigar out of his mouth, pointed the wet end at me, and leaned heavier against my desk. You're going to let him do it, Vance repeated, his voice dropping an octave, scraping against the bottom of his throat. You are going to let this kid who didn't know what a fifth-wheel coupling was until you bought him a textbook, Fire you from your own damn company. He's going to fire me from Northbound Logistics. I corrected him gently. There is a massive difference. I didn't explain the rest to Vance right then. Plausible deniability is a gift you give to your friends when you know the corporate lawyers are eventually going to start asking aggressive questions. I just told him to keep his head down, manage the fleet, and wait for my signal. He grunted, put his cigar back in his mouth, and walked out, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. Let me back up for a second, because if you don't understand how heavy-duty trucking fleets actually operate, Julian's plan probably sounds pretty bulletproof. Most people think a trucking company owns its trucks, and some smaller outfits do. But when you get to a certain size, liability becomes a noose waiting to tighten around your neck. If one of my drivers hits a patch of black ice on Interstate 80, outside of Laramie, Wyoming, and jackknifes into a luxury SUV, the resulting lawsuit doesn't just go after the insurance policy. The lawyers go after the assets. They go after the trucks, the yard, the building, the whole kingdom. So, 22 years ago, on the advice of a very sharp, very expensive tax attorney named Eris in downtown Detroit, I split my life in half. Northbound Logistics, the company Julian was currently trying to steal out from under me, was strictly an operating company. It handled the dispatch routing, the driver payroll, the client contracts, the human resources headaches, and the fancy new software Julian loved so much. It had the bold blue logo on the side of the building. It had the expensive glass-walled boardroom. But Northbound Logistics did not actually own a single lug nut. Every single one of our 140 trucks, the newer Kenworth T680S, the dependable Peterbilt 597 Danes, the older Freightliner Cascadias we kept for local runs, was owned by a quiet, boring little LLC called Elias Holdings. I was the sole proprietor of Elias Holdings. There was no board of directors. There were no MBA graduates in tailored suits voting on margins. Just me, a business bank account, and the physical titles to $40 million worth of rolling heavy machinery. Northbound Logistics leased those trucks from Elias Holdings, month to month, and buried on page 42 of that 70-page master lease agreement was a standard key person clause. It stated, in very clear, very dry legal terms, that if Elias was removed from operational control of Northbound Logistics, involuntarily, the lease was immediately null and void. The trucks would have to be returned to the holding company within 24 hours, or they would be considered stolen property. Julian didn't know about Elias Holdings, or if he did, he thought it was just a dead shell account for tax purposes. He didn't read page 42. He was too busy measuring the drapes for my office and convincing his friends that he was a visionary. The next 3 days were an exercise in supreme restraint. Have you ever had to sit across from someone you love, knowing they are actively trying to destroy you and ask them to pass the salt? It requires a specific kind of compartmentalization. I invited Julian over for dinner on Wednesday night. Just a normal family meal at my house. I cooked a beef pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the way my sister used to make it. He sat at my kitchen table, drinking a glass of scotch I poured for him, telling me about his weekend. His leg was bouncing under the table, just a rapid, nervous vibration that rattled the silverware slightly against the porcelain plates. He was anxious. He thought it was the anxiety of the kill. How are the new board members settling in? I asked, cutting a piece of meat. Great, Julian said. His eyes darted to the grandfather clock in the corner, then back to my face. They're bringing a lot of fresh perspective, Uncle Elias. We're really looking at modernizing the asset management protocols. Asset management. I repeated the word slowly. I took a bite of my food and chewed it deliberately. That sounds complicated. It's just the future. He smiled. It was a thin, brittle smile. You don't need to worry about it. You've worked hard enough. Maybe it's time you started thinking about that fishing cabin in Traverse City you always talk about. He was testing the waters, seeing if I would go quietly, seeing if the tired old man was ready to lie down in the snow and just go to sleep. Maybe, I said. I didn't smile back. I just kept eating. I went very, very quiet. That's the thing about anger. Most people think anger is loud. They think it's broken glass, red faces, and shouting in hallways. But real anger, the kind that changes the trajectory of your life, is silent. It feels like lowering your heart rate on purpose. It is a slow, cold calculation. On Thursday, the day before the scheduled board vote, I spent the afternoon down in the maintenance pit. I didn't wear my suit. I put on my old canvas coveralls, the ones permanently stained with axle grease and hydraulic fluid at the knees. There was a 2018 Volvo VNL that had been throwing a phantom code on the diagnostic reader, and the younger mechanics couldn't figure it out. I slid under the massive chassis on a wooden creeper. The smell of cold metal, ozone, and diesel fuel wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I needed the grounding. I needed to touch the physical reality of my life before Julian tried to turn it all into paper and equity. Vance came down to the pit about an hour later. He crouched down, his knees popping like dry firecrackers, and looked under the truck at me. They officially set the meeting, Vance said, his voice echoing slightly against the concrete walls of the pit. Friday morning, 8 sharp. The 3 suits are flying in tonight from Chicago. Julian told the dispatchers to route all incoming high-level calls to his assistant, starting tomorrow at noon. I wiped a smudge of black grease off the oil pan with a red shop rag. He's confident. He's a fool. Vance grunted, shifting his weight. What are we doing, Elias? I'm not going to sit up there and watch that kid pack your boxes while he talks about corporate synergy. I rolled the creeper out from under the truck and sat up. I looked at Vance directly. Are the GPS tracking units on all 140 rigs transmitting cleanly? I asked. Vance narrowed his eyes. Yeah. Upgraded the entire fleet's telematics last month. I can tell you if a driver sneezes in Omaha. Good. And the spare master keys for the fleet? In the heavy safe in my office? Like always. Keep them there. I stood up and wiped my hands on the rag, feeling the rough fabric against my calluses. Tomorrow, when he calls me into the boardroom, I want you to go to the yard. You tell the mechanics to drop their tools. You tell dispatch to hold all outgoing loads at the terminal. Elias, if I hold the loads, we breach contract with 6 different regional distributors by lunchtime. I know. Julian will fire me too for insubordination. He can't fire you, I said softly, tossing the red rag into a metal bin, because you don't work for Northbound Logistics anymore. As of midnight tonight, you work directly for Elias Holdings. Vance stared at me for a long time. The gears in his head were turning, clicking into place as he finally saw the edge of the real board we were playing on. He didn't smile. Vance doesn't really smile, but he nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement that carried the weight of a blood oath. Understood, he said. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat in my living room, in a brown leather armchair that had conformed perfectly to my spine over the last 15 years. I didn't turn on the lamps. I just watched the street lamps outside cast long yellow shadows across the hardwood floor. I thought about my sister. I thought about the promise I made to her at the hospice facility, holding her frail, cold hand, telling her I would make sure Julian became a good man, a capable man. I realized, sitting in the dark with the silence pressing against my eardrums, that I had failed her. I had made him a wealthy man. I had made him an educated man. But somewhere along the line, the entitlement had rotted the foundation out from under his character. And now, the only way to save him from himself, the only way to teach him the lesson he desperately needed to learn, was to tear the whole house down around him. Some things have to be broken before they can be fixed. And some things just stay broken forever. I didn't know which one Julian would be yet. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind coming off Lake Michigan. I drove to the office in my 2015 Ford F-250. I didn't rush. I drove the speed limit. I parked in my usual spot, right by the front glass doors of the administrative building. When I walked into the lobby, the atmosphere was completely dead. The receptionist, a sweet woman named Sarah, who had been with us for 6 years, wouldn't meet my eyes. She was staring intently at her monitor, her posture rigid. The silence in the hallway had actual physical weight to it. I walked slowly down the corridor toward my office. The door to the glass boardroom was open. Inside, Julian was standing at the head of the long oak table, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my first down payment on a truck. His 3 board members were sitting down, their laptops open, looking like a tribunal waiting to sentence the accused. Julian looked up as I walked past. Our eyes met. His jaw was tight, but there was a flicker of absolute triumph in his expression. It was the pure arrogance of youth, believing that a signed piece of paper could alter gravity. He stepped out of the boardroom and intercepted me before I reached my office door. "Uncle Elias," he said. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, entirely devoid of the kid who used to cry on my porch. "Do you have a minute? The board needs to speak with you." I looked at him. I looked at the tailored suit, the expensive watch, the Italian loafers that made no sound. I felt that same ice in my chest, cold and perfectly clear. "Sure, Julian," I said quietly. "Zzz. Let's talk." I walked into the boardroom. The air conditioning was cranked up so high it felt like a meat locker. The three board members, let's call them Suit 1, Suit 2, and Suit 3, because honestly, their names didn't matter to me then, and they don't matter now, were sitting with their hands folded on the polished oak table. Julian stood at the head of the table. He didn't offer me a seat. That was a power play. He probably read in an airport bookstore paperback about corporate dominance. I pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs anyway and sat down. The thick leather creaked loudly in the quiet room. "Ellis," Suit 1 started. He had a perfectly trimmed beard and eyes that looked like wet river stones. "We called you in here today to discuss the operational trajectory of northbound logistics. Over the past 4 quarters, we've noticed a stagnation in growth, specifically regarding our regional expansion models." I tuned him out. I didn't care about his corporate vocabulary. I was watching Julian. His hands were flat on the table, the knuckles just slightly white. He was nervous. His jaw was doing that slow grinding thing again. Suit 2 slid a thick manila envelope across the table. It stopped an inch from my hand. "We've also reviewed the company's liability profile," Suit 2 said, his voice dripping with that forced synthetic empathy you only hear in HR departments, specifically regarding executive health and competency. "It has come to the board's attention that you've had 17 medical appointments in the last 10 months. "Arthritis," I said softly. "In my knees. It comes from crawling under heavy transmissions for 30 years, so you boys can sit in air-conditioned rooms wearing clean shirts." "Be that as it may," Julian cut in. His voice was sharper now, eager to take control of the narrative. "The board has taken a vote, Uncle Elias. A unanimous vote. Section 4, Paragraph B of the corporate bylaws allows the board to remove the acting CEO with a supermajority if medical competency is deemed a liability risk to the shareholders. We are executing that clause today." There it was. The knife went all the way in. It was a neat, bloodless assassination, executed on expensive paper. I looked at the envelope. I didn't open it. "And what's in there?" "Your severance package," Julian said. He actually tried to force a sympathetic smile, but it looked like a crack in a porcelain plate. "It's generous. 2 years of your current salary, full medical benefits. You keep the company truck. You can finally go up to Traverse City. Relax. You have earned the rest, Uncle Elias." I measured twice. I said quietly, looking directly into Julian's eyes. "I cut once. Are you absolutely sure this is the cut you want to make?" "It's just business, Elias." Suit 3 chimed in from the corner. I didn't look at Suit 3. I kept my eyes entirely on my nephew. "I wasn't asking you. I was asking the boy I taught how to bleed brake lines." Julian swallowed hard. The Adam's apple in his throat bobbed visibly. "It's done, Uncle Elias. Please don't make this difficult. Sign the separation agreement. Security will help you pack your office." I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I reached into my chest pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and put them on. I opened the envelope, took out the separation agreement, and flipped straight to the last page. I clicked my ballpoint pen. The room was completely silent. They had expected a fight. They had expected me to threaten them, to scream about lawyers, equity, and betrayal. When you give a man nothing to push against, he usually falls over. I signed my name on the dotted line. The scratch of the pen sounded incredibly loud. I closed the folder, took off my glasses, and stood up. "I will be out of the building in 15 minutes, I said. I turned and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't look back. I walked down the long hallway to my office. Julian followed me, hovering about 5 feet behind, like a stray dog that wasn't sure if it was going to get kicked or fed. "Uncle Elias," he said as I opened my office door, "I want you to know this wasn't personal. The company just needs to evolve." I grabbed an empty cardboard paper box from the supply closet. I didn't pack the glass plaques. I didn't pack the framed photographs of the modern trucks. I picked up my 1988 snap-on torque wrench with the hairline crack in the handle and placed it gently into the bottom of the box. I took a worn leather ledger where I kept my personal handwritten notes. That was it. "Are you fine?" Julian asked. He sounded almost panicked by my absolute silence. "Fine is a word that sounds like a compliment but isn't," I said, picking up the box. "I'm exactly where I need to be." I walked out of the office. The dispatch floor was dead quiet. The drivers and the logistics coordinators were all staring at their monitors, pretending they weren't watching the founder of the company get escorted out by the new regime. I walked out the double glass doors into the cold Michigan wind. I put my cardboard box in the passenger seat of my F-250. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, listening to the wind howl off the lake. My hands were perfectly steady, which, if you know me, is the closest thing to a miracle you will ever see on a Friday morning. I pulled out my phone and dialed Vance. He answered immediately. "Done," I said. He pushed the button. Vance exhaled a thick cloud of cigar smoke. I could hear it rushing over the phone speaker. "All right," the hammer drops. "Shut it down, Vance. All of it." I hung up the phone, started the truck, and drove out of the yard. I didn't go home. I drove 3 miles down the road to a little 24-hour diner I've been eating at since 1995. I sat in a back booth. The vinyl seat was cracked, held together by faded silver duct tape. I watched a salt shaker on the table. It had a small dent in the aluminum cap. I picked it up, feeling the cold metal, rolling it between my fingers. When your life changes direction at 100 miles an hour, you have to focus on the small things. The waitress, a woman named Patty who has known my coffee order for 2 decades, walked over and poured a black coffee into a thick ceramic mug. "You look like you're plotting a bank robbery, Elias," she said, resting the glass pot on her hip. "Just a withdrawal, Patty," I said softly. "Just a withdrawal." Back at the northbound logistics terminal, exactly 5 minutes after I drove off the lot, the illusion of Julian's victory began to shatter. I know this because Vance told me every detail later. Julian had walked back onto the dispatch floor, standing near the center, probably preparing to give some sort of rallying speech to the troops about synergy and the bold new future. He never got the chance. On the massive wall-mounted monitors that tracked the GPS telematics of our 140 trucks, a sudden, cascading change occurred. Our trucks were represented by little green dots moving across the digital map of the Midwest. Green meant moving, yellow meant idling, red meant offline. At 9:15 a.m., exactly as Vance walked into the server room and executed the command I had authorized, 68 trucks that were currently in the terminal yard turned red on the board. A second later, 20 more trucks parked at a distribution center in Ohio turned red. Then, 30 trucks sitting at various truck stops across the Rust Belt went red. "What's going on with the board?" Julian asked, his voice sharp. The lead dispatcher, a kid named Mark, who had a nervous habit of chewing the inside of his cheek, started typing frantically. The mechanical clacking of his keyboard sounded like machine gun fire in the sudden silence of the room. "I don't know. The telematics are dropping offline. The engine immobilizers are engaging remotely. It's like the trucks are just shutting down." Julian rushed to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the main staging yard. Below him, the low thrumming vibration of 68 idling diesel engines, a sound that was the literal heartbeat of the company, suddenly began to stutter. One by one, in a cascading wave of mechanical silence, the engines died. The drivers were turning off their ignitions, stepping out of their cabs, and dropping the keys into secure drop boxes Vance had installed the night before. Julian pulled out his phone and called Vance. It went straight to voicemail. He marched out of the dispatch center and went down the stairs, 2 at a time, bursting into the fleet manager's office. Vance wasn't there. His desk was completely cleared off. The only thing left was a single unlit cigar, resting perfectly in the center of the green felt blotter. But worse than that, the heavy iron safe in the corner of the room was wide open. The racks inside, which usually held 140 master spare keys, were completely empty. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. I was sitting in my booth at the diner, watching the steam curl off the top of my black coffee. Outside, a light freezing rain had started to fall, slicking the asphalt in a thin sheen of ice. My cell phone rang. The screen displayed Julian's name. I let it ring 4 times. On the 5th ring, I picked it up and held it to my ear. I didn't say anything. Uncle Elias, Julian's voice came through the speaker. The arrogant, rehearsed corporate tone was entirely gone. He sounded breathless. He sounded like a kid who had just realized the ice he was standing on was an inch thick. Where is Vance? Why are the drivers locking their trucks in the yard? And where are the master keys? I took a slow sip of my coffee. The diner smelled like bacon grease and old bleach. It was a very grounding detail in a morning that felt surreal. Vance doesn't work for you anymore, Julian, I said, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of anger. And neither do the drivers. What are you talking about? They are northbound employees. Check their contracts, Julian. They are contracted to drive the equipment. If there is no equipment, there is no work. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence had actual weight to it. I could hear his breathing. What do you mean, no equipment? Julian asked. The panic was bleeding through now, raw and undeniable. I'm looking at 68 trucks sitting in my yard. That's the problem, Julian, I said softly, looking out the diner window at the gray Michigan sky. It's not your yard, and those aren't your trucks. Are you crazy? Julian practically shouted into the phone. The desperation was sharp now, cutting through the thin veneer of his MBA education. I am the CEO of Northbound Logistics. I have the board minutes right here. I control the assets. You control the operating company, Julian. I corrected him. My voice was low, steady, the vocal equivalent of setting a heavy stone down on a glass table. You control the payroll software. You control the dispatch screens. You control the lease on the office building. But you do not own a single truck. You do not own a single trailer. You do not own the ground those trucks are parked on. That's impossible. The trucks are branded with our logo. Vinyl decals cost $200 a piece, son. Ownership costs a whole lot more. I leaned back in the cracked vinyl booth. 22 years ago, I structured Northbound Logistics to lease every piece of heavy machinery it uses from an entity called Elias Holdings. I am the sole owner of Elias Holdings. I hold the pink slips to 140 semi-trucks in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Read page 42 of the master lease agreement. The one sitting in the filing cabinet you never bothered to open because you were too busy taking my board members out for $85 steaks. The silence on the line stretched out. It was a beautiful, terrible silence. I could almost hear the structural integrity of his entire world collapsing in real time. Page 42. I continued softly, is a key person clause. It stipulates that if I am removed from operational control of Northbound Logistics without my explicit notarized consent, the master lease is immediately nullified. You fired me this morning, Julian. The second you countersigned that separation agreement, you breached the lease. The trucks are now legally stolen property. You set this up, he stammered. The realization hit him like a physical blow. You set this up from the beginning. I didn't set it up for you, I said. The coldness in my chest was absolute now. I set it up to protect my life's work from predatory creditors. You just happened to walk into the trap. I'll sue you. I'll take this to court. The board will tie you up in litigation for a decade. With what money? I asked gently. You have no assets. You have no trucks to haul freight. By noon today, you will be in breach of contract with 6 major regional distributors because your fleet is paralyzed. The penalties for those breaches will bankrupt Northbound's operating accounts by Tuesday. Your 3 suit-wearing friends on the board aren't going to fund a legal battle, Julian. They are going to jump ship to avoid the fiduciary liability of running a logistics company that can't logistically move anything. They will leave you holding the bag. You can't do this to me. I'm your family. The entitlement finally broke through. It always does. You stopped being family the moment you brought a manila folder into my office and tried to use my arthritis as a weapon to steal 40 years of my blood and sweat, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I measured twice. I cut once. The cut is made, Julian. You are bleeding out, and you don't even realize it yet. I hung up the phone. I didn't turn it off. I just set it face down on the table, next to the dented salt shaker. Patty walked by and topped off my coffee without saying a word. She knew a man staring down the barrel of a hard decision when she saw one. At 11 a.m., Vance walked into the diner. He looked exactly the same as he always did. Work boots, canvas jacket, unlit cigar clamped in the corner of his mouth. He slid into the booth across from me. He dropped a heavy canvas bank bag onto the table. It landed with a dull, metallic clinking sound. 140 master keys, Vance said, his voice a low rumble. The physical keys to the terminal gates are in there too. The yard is locked down. The drivers are all sitting at the local union hall. They know the score. They're loyal to the guy who pays their mortgages, not the guy who sends them emails about synergy. Did he try to stop you? I asked. He came running out into the yard while I was padlocking the main gate. He was screaming something about police and trespassing. I reminded him that Elias Holdings owns the physical real estate of the terminal yard, and Northbound Logistics is currently trespassing on my client's property. He went pale, like he swallowed a bad oyster. I nodded slowly. The coffee was lukewarm now, but I drank it anyway. So Vance leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. We have the trucks. We have the drivers. We have the drivers. We have the yard, but Northbound still holds the client contracts. What's the next move? We can't sit on $40 million worth of idle machinery. We aren't going to sit on it, I said, pulling a folded piece of paper from my breast pocket. It was a document I had drafted with Arias, my lawyer in Detroit, 3 days ago. Julian doesn't know it yet, but the client contracts have the same key person clauses written into them. I negotiated those deals personally 20 years ago. The distributors trust me. They don't trust an MBA with a spreadsheet. I slid the paper across the table to Vance. He unfolded it and read it. His eyebrows went up slightly. A new operating LLC. Vance read aloud. Midwest Freight Solutions. Founded yesterday. I filed the paperwork Thursday morning, while I was covered in grease under that Volvo VNL, I said. By 3 p.m. today, Eris will notify all 6 major distributors that Northbound Logistics has suffered a catastrophic operational failure and is in breach of contract. Simultaneously, Midwest Freight Solutions will offer to step in, honor the exact same rates, and assume the routes immediately. We have the trucks. We have the drivers. We are the only entity capable of moving their freight by tomorrow morning. Vance slowly took the cigar out of his mouth. He looked at me, a deep, genuine respect settling into the lines of his face. You built a lifeboat, Vance said softly, and you're going to let him drown on the ship. He drilled the holes in the hull himself, I replied. I'm just refusing to go down with it. By 5 p.m. on Friday, the implosion of Julian's world was complete. It didn't happen with an explosion. It happened with a whimper. The 3 board members he brought in realized exactly what they had done. They had ousted the only man holding the keys to the kingdom, facing massive liability for the breached shipping contracts and no physical assets to leverage. They resigned immediately. They sent their resignations via email and took the first flights back to Chicago, leaving Julian alone in a massive, empty building with an operating company that was hemorrhaging cash by the hour. At 6:30 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Julian again. I picked it up. Elias, please, he whispered. He was crying. It was the exact same sound he made on my porch when he was 16. Uncle Elias, please. The bank just froze the operational accounts because the distributors pulled their contracts. I can't even make payroll for the administrative staff on Monday. I'll lose everything. They'll sue me personally for fiduciary negligence. I closed my eyes. The anger was gone. The coldness was gone. All that was left was a profound, heavy exhaustion. It sat in my bones like lead. "You won't lose everything, Julian," I said gently, "because you never had anything to begin with. You tried to steal a house you didn't know how to build." "I'll give it back," he sobbed. "I'll resign. I'll give you back the CEO title. Just turn the trucks back on, please." "The trucks are already on, son," I said softly. "They're moving freight under a new company, a company you have absolutely no equity in. You are the sole managing director of Northbound Logistics, and Northbound Logistics is a dead entity." "What am I supposed to do?" he begged. "You're supposed to learn," I said. "You're supposed to understand that you can't optimize human loyalty on a spreadsheet. You're supposed to realize that the man who built the table always knows how to take it apart. You're going to ruin me." "I already did," I said, and I didn't even have to raise my voice. The weekend passed in a blur of legal filings, hushed phone calls, and the kind of logistical triage that leaves a permanent metallic taste in your mouth. You don't dismantle a $40 million operating structure and rebuild it under a new name in 48 hours without breaking a sweat. But that is exactly what I did. By Monday morning, Northbound Logistics was effectively a ghost ship. The administrative building was locked. The servers were dark. The payroll accounts were frozen by the bank due to the sudden catastrophic breach of 6 major distribution contracts. It took exactly 6 days for Julian's attorneys, the cheap ones he had to hire after the board members fled back to Chicago, to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy on behalf of the company. Midwest Freight Solutions, however, was fully operational by 4 a.m. on Monday. We didn't have a fancy glass-walled boardroom. We didn't have ergonomic chairs or a receptionist named Sarah. We set up base camp in a repurposed corrugated steel warehouse on the south side of Grand Rapids, right next to the main holding yard, where all 140 trucks were securely parked. Vance had gone to a local hardware store and bought 4 white folding tables and a dozen metal folding chairs. That was our dispatch center. I remember walking into that warehouse on Monday morning. The air was frigid, smelling faintly of old dust, and fresh coffee brewing from a cheap plastic percolator Vance had plugged into a wall outlet. There were no monitors yet. Vance was managing the morning routes on a massive rolling whiteboard, using a black dry erase marker to assign drivers to trucks and loads. It was raw, it was chaotic, and it was the most beautiful thing I had seen in a decade. By 6 a.m., the drivers started showing up. All of them. Not a single man or woman took a job with a competitor over the weekend. They walked into the freezing warehouse, grabbed a styrofoam cup of black coffee, found their name on Vance's whiteboard, and took their new keys. A few of the older guys, men who had been driving for me since the late 90s, stopped by my folding table. They didn't say much. A nod, a firm handshake, a quiet, "Good to see you, Elias." Loyalty isn't something you can buy with a corporate team-building lunch at a steakhouse. Loyalty is built in the maintenance pits at 2 in the morning when a transmission drops and the boss is down there in the grease with you. We didn't miss a single delivery that Monday. The supply chain didn't even blink. The milk got to the grocery stores. The automotive parts got to the assembly lines in Detroit. The world kept turning, completely oblivious to the fact that a boardroom empire had crumbled to dust over the weekend. I didn't see Julian for 3 weeks. I didn't call him, and he didn't call me. I knew through Aris, my attorney, that the bankruptcy proceedings were brutal, because Julian had signed several operational guarantees, thinking the company's revenue was bulletproof. The creditors were piercing the corporate veil. They were coming after him personally. He was looking at roughly $1.2 million in personal liability. It was the kind of debt that ruins a man before his life even really begins. It was a late Thursday afternoon when he finally showed up at the new warehouse. The sun was setting, casting long, harsh shadows across the gravel lot. I was sitting at my folding table, reviewing fuel tax documents. I heard the crunch of tires and looked up to see his leased BMW sedan parked near the chain-link fence. He walked into the warehouse, and for a second, my chest tightened. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He didn't look like a visionary. He looked exactly like the 16-year-old kid who had stood on my porch in the rain all those years ago. He was wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt. He had lost weight. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He stopped a few feet from my table. The loud hum of the warehouse heater filled the silence between us. "Hey, Uncle Elias," he said. His voice was raspy, completely stripped of that polished, arrogant cadence. "Julian," I said evenly. I didn't offer him a chair, mostly because the only empty one was currently holding a stack of bill of lading forms. "What can I do for you?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key fob. He set it gently on the edge of my table. "That's the key to the administrative building. The bank is foreclosing on the lease tomorrow. I figured you might want to get any personal items you left behind." "I brought everything I needed when I walked out," I said, not touching the key. Julian nodded slowly, staring at the concrete floor. "The creditors are seizing my personal accounts on Monday. They're taking my car, my apartment. They're talking about fraud charges because I signed off on the fourth quarter projections knowing the medical leave clause was a gamble." He finally looked up at me. His eyes were red. "I'm ruined, Uncle Elias. I have absolutely nothing left." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about the anger I had felt sitting in that diner. I thought about the cold calculation it took to shut down his entire world. But looking at him now, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. Revenge, even when it is entirely justified, is a hollow meal. It fills you up for an hour, and then you're just left sitting alone at the table. I opened the heavy leather ledger sitting on my desk. I pulled out a cashier's check that I had asked Iris to draft 2 days prior. I slid it across the table. It stopped right next to the key fob. Julian looked down at it. He frowned, leaning in slightly to read the numbers. It was a check made out to his primary creditor for $1.2 million. Exactly enough to clear his personal liability and keep him out of federal prison. His breath hitched. He looked at me, his face pale. I don't understand." "It's not a loan," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the absolute weight of finality. "I am paying off your debt. You will not file for personal bankruptcy, but there are conditions." Julian didn't speak. He just stared at the piece of paper like it was a live wire. "You are going to leave Michigan," I told him. "You are going to move away from Grand Rapids. You are going to find a job that has absolutely nothing to do with logistics, trucking, or supply chains, and you are never going to ask me for another dime, as long as you live." "Uncle Elias, I am not doing this because I forgive you," I interrupted him, holding up one hand, just one. The silence in the warehouse felt heavier than the engine blocks sitting in the yard. "I am doing this because I made a promise to your mother to keep you safe. I kept that promise. But the man sitting at this table right now is not your uncle anymore. He is just the guy who owns the trucks. Do we understand each other?" Julian looked at my face. He saw the cold, unyielding reality in my eyes. The bridge wasn't just burned. The ashes had been swept away, and the river had swallowed the stones. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the check. "Yes, sir," he whispered. He turned around and walked out of the warehouse. He didn't look back. I watched his car back out of the lot, the tail lights fading into the evening traffic, until he was gone entirely. That was 3 years ago. Midwest Freight Solutions is currently doing $45 million a year in gross revenue. We moved out of the steel warehouse and bought a modest brick building right next to the maintenance bays. Vance finally retired last month, though he still shows up on Tuesdays just to drink my coffee and complain about the new diagnostic software. I heard through the grapevine that Julian is living in Denver, working as a mid-level manager at a software company. We don't speak. Some days I wonder if I did the right thing. I wonder if I was too harsh or if I should have seen the warning signs earlier. But most days, I know I did the only thing I could do. That's enough. I don't regret what I did. I regret that I had to do it. Family is supposed to be the one safe harbor in a world full of storms. But sometimes, the storm starts inside the house. And when it does, you have to be willing to board up the windows and survive it. I sat alone in my office as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The yard outside was quiet, save for the low rhythmic thrum of a few idling diesel engines waiting for the night shift to begin. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out my old Mean Teen 88 snap-on torque wrench. I ran my thumb over the hairline crack in the plastic grip. It's funny how the broken things are usually the ones that last the longest. I put the wrench back in the drawer, closed it, and turned off the light.